Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Before we begin, we would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the maximize icon at the top right of the widget or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. If you have any questions for presenters during the webcast, you can click on the purple Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We'll address as many questions as possible during the event. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow help widget as a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. You can also submit technical issues via the Q&A widget. Please note, most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command-R on Mac to refresh your player console. Finally, an on-demand version of this webcast will be available approximately 1 day after the webcast using the same audience link to join today's event. Now I'd like to introduce Dave Wittenberg. Dave, you now have the floor.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our forum on vulnerable populations. I am Mathematica's Disability Area Director, and I'm delighted to introduce this forum and moderate today. And it's a particularly timely topic, especially given in April, nearly 1 million people with disabilities lost their jobs. And while there's been some slight recovery in May, there is this overarching concern of whether or not the labor force detachment will be permanent. So today we're going to talk about those general trends and look at two groups at the opposite ends of the working age spectrum. And while the groups are different in composition, the interesting general punchline that you can take away, I think, from the panelists and the discussions today is first, the risk of the long-term detachment from the labor force for both groups is really, really important and has long-term implications, not only just economically, but also real societal loss. The second is, as we think about policy options, I think one of the things that combines the two is the need to think about policy options now. So with that overview to the topic of vulnerable populations for today, let me introduce the speakers. First off, we have Purvi Sevik from Mathematica, who will offer a more detailed overview of labor market considerations for vulnerable groups, and especially what past recessions may signal about what to expect going forward. Next, Teresa Gil-Reducci of the New School will offer statistics about what older workers are facing based on her role as the director of the New School's Retirement Equity Lab. Finally, Kelly Pavich from the Bridges to School to Work will offer an on-the-ground perspective discussing what she has experienced during the COVID economy so far. The Bridges program is very interesting because it operates in 12 major cities across the country, helping transition-age special education students, often from Title I schools, find and maintain work. So just as a few ground rules, we'll start by having each panelist talk for about 5 minutes of their perspective of their unique population they study and serve. And after that, I'll ask a few questions before opening it up to audience questions, which Brian mentioned you can put into the chat function for a few minutes. So with that overview, Purvi, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I'm Purvi Sevik from Mathematica, where I direct several research projects focused on improving employment outcomes for people with disabilities, including a collaboration with the University of New Hampshire on employment policy and measurement, and a collaboration with Hunter College on improving transitions to employment for youth from minority backgrounds with disabilities, both funded by the National Institute for Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. So as Dave noted, while the employment impacts of COVID-19 are still unfolding, it's already clear that some groups have been hit particularly hard. And while we don't know when the recovery will begin, the economic recovery that is, there are lessons from previous recessions, including the Great Recession, that give us reasons to be concerned. What's different this time is that some of the groups that are being hit the hardest by COVID in terms of rates and health outcomes are also the same groups that are being hit hard by the labor market. The groups that we're going to talk about today include Black and Hispanic workers, older workers, and workers with disabilities. I'm going to start by sharing some long-term employment trends. This graph shows the employment to population ratio among people with and without disabilities by year since 2008. I want to credit my colleagues at University of New Hampshire for producing this graphic and for letting me share it. I know we're used to hearing unemployment statistics, but I chose this measure of the employment to population ratio for describing trends over time, because the unemployment rate can miss people who have left the labor force over time, and this is especially true for people with disabilities. So here in this chart, the blue line plots the employment rate for people without disabilities, and the green line plots the employment rate for people with disabilities. While it shows that the employment rate of people with disabilities is always lower than that for people without disabilities, it also reveals how past recessions have disproportionately affected people with disabilities, specifically the Great Recession. Past recessions have shown us that job loss is longer in duration and the recovery comes later for people with disabilities. We can see this on the left side of this chart, looking from 2008 to 2014. The impact of the Great Recession on the employment rate of people without disabilities was its worst in 2010, after which we started to experience a slow and steady increase in employment rates. But for people with disabilities, the employment rate continued to decline for several years and did not begin to rise until 2014. But now I'm going to turn to unemployment rates because, as we know, these are the best measure in real time of the population that wants to work but doesn't have a job. First, and these are numbers from April, there are newer numbers available, workers with disabilities had an unemployment rate of 18.9%, almost 5 percentage points higher than the unemployment rate of 14.4% for the full population. As it turns out, the uptick in unemployment for people with disabilities was less dramatic than it has been in past recessions, including in comparison to people without disabilities. So that might be a reason for some cautious optimism. So next, I'm going to do some comparisons by race and ethnicity. The unemployment rates that we saw nationally have hit Black and Hispanic workers at higher rates. This slide shows that the April unemployment rate was 16.4% among Black workers and 18.5% among Hispanic workers, both rates notably higher than the national rate. Most of these disparities across groups are present at every level of educational attainment, both the disparities by race and by disability, meaning that Blacks with advanced degrees have higher rates of unemployment than whites with advanced degrees, and college grads with disabilities have higher rates of unemployment than college grads without disabilities. The intersection of disability and race and ethnicity also magnifies these disparities. Now I'm going to look by age. In all economic downturns, the group that loses jobs first is youth and young adults. And we can see here that their unemployment rate of 32% is actually twice the national rate, more than twice the national rate. So many of you might be thinking that youth unemployment is not as worrisome as adult unemployment, that they're just missing some pocket money. But the reality is that it's important and can have long-term implications. Many employed youth provide needed resources for their family. Studies have also found that having a paid job while a teen is the best predictor of future employment success as an adult, especially for youth from lower socioeconomic status. Kelly will talk about one program, as Dave mentioned, that is working hard to keep these youth employed and engaged even during the pandemic. Older workers have also emerged as a vulnerable group. And while the April rate shown in this chart shows only a slightly higher unemployment rate of 15.3% among workers over age 65, Teresa will share some more detailed statistics about this group and workers in their 50s that will give you cause for concern. And we know that many people in these age groups have new onset and continuing disabilities, presenting an additional barrier as well. With that, I'll hand it back to Dave.
All right, and next up, we have Teresa.
Thank you. In the first slide, please. I'm a professor of economics, and we are looking at the conditions for older workers, pre-recession and post-recession. So I will share with you the bottom line pre-existing conditions for older workers and their older selves when they retire, and also what our model is saying about how the recession will affect older workers' ability to retire comfortably. The first slide, please. Here are, if you will, the pre-existing condition in the United States. Because of our public policies, and because of the balance of power between labor and capital has moved away from unions and working people and towards employers during a period of liberal economic policies that was very distinct in the United States from the rest of the rich countries. And here I'm just looking at the G7 countries. we've had a period of time where the G7 countries, except for us, have invested in longevity. And so their older people are living longer. And these are people 55 and above. I'm looking at their mortality rates. And they've also invested in more secure pension plans, Social Security, and also worker plans. In the U.S., our investments over the last 40 years have really gone in the opposite direction. Now, 50 years, we have maintained the incomes of older people by encouraging them or forcing them to work, and the post-55 longevity has lagged way behind the rest of the G7, which means that other rich countries have pulled ahead of us in terms of how many years the average 65-year-old could expect to live and be retired. So we have disinvested in retirement time where the rest of the rich world has invested in more retirement time. So now the average retiree can expect in the United States to have about 21 years of retirement. These are men and women, whereas in the G7, except for us, it's about 24. So time is an important resource for all of us, and the elderly in the United States are getting less of it in terms of retirement. The next slide shows you the results of our model that we have estimated and put online. I think our launch was at the beginning of April, which our model asks the question, before the recession and before this particular virus that affects older people more, what were the chances that a middle-class older worker, someone who is middle-class about ready to retire, would be able to maintain their living standards? How many would improve their living standards? And how many would fall below a de facto poverty standard? And we found that most middle-class older workers before the recession could avoid de facto poverty. We are showing that at 11 million people in total, another 1 million people because of this recession who are middle class now will be downwardly mobile in old age. So they're facing downward mobility, which has economic consequences as well as political consequences. Stability is one thing. Increasing and improving your standard of living is another thing, but being downwardly mobile in this massive way has other kinds of implications. And we will see the effect of this de facto poverty increase among older people affect cities first, then states, and then the federal government, because states and localities provide most of the services to impoverished elderly. The next slide, please. The next slide goes behind the model to show you that much of the increase in poverty among the elderly is coming from the massive amounts of unemployment we see in the last 2 months. A little bit with the decline in their assets. We don't think that asset values will increase as they did in the last 10 years. But most of the shock is coming from the unemployment and from the fact that older workers have a longer time to become employed again, and they're much less likely to get a job that paid what they used to have. So here we have, again, a pre-existing conditions were that the older workers, 55 and over, were a bit insulated from recessions, that their unemployment rate would not increase as much as younger workers would in recessions. That changed during this recession. And the next and last slide will show you some surprising patterns. Look at my men and women. Look at the yellow bar, that's 65 and over, and those rates are higher than young people. Again, that wasn't true before. But the middle-aged men had a little slightly gentler hit on this recession than the younger workers or 65-year-olds. But note, the past trends were interesting, that the older workers were a bit insulated. But now there are millions, tens of millions more older workers than we saw 30 years ago. So scale isn't really reflected here. But remember, when you have the unemployment rate of a 65 plus, we're talking about 10 and 15 million people. So female older people are hit worse than men. But take a look at people with degrees. It used to be that older people with advanced degrees were the most insulated from a recession. And that's what switched here. This is Richard Johnson from the Urban Institute's data. The unemployment rate among older workers, both 55 to 64 and 65 plus, are higher than they are for younger, more educated workers. It's especially true for those with advanced degrees, and now we'll look at race. Again, just as Purvi showed, the Hispanic workers are seeing higher rates of unemployment in this age group, in the older age group, than Black or white. And again, the whites, non-Hispanic whites, are experiencing lower unemployment rates, except for the folks over 65. So in closing, I want to reflect back to the first graph, the pre-existing conditions where older workers in America could expect a lot less retirement time. The time of retirement actually may go up if they never go back in the labor force. But because of our weak Social Security system in a relative term, they may be spending more of that retirement time with less income. I showed that in the second slide. And moreover, the impact of the virus on older people who may have to go back to work and not in unsafe conditions could be that the longevity rates of people over 55 may see more of a downturn. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Teresa. We appreciate that summary, and it dovetails nicely with Purvi's summary. We're going to pivot here a bit to you, Kelly, and really talking about the role of community providers to help vulnerable groups, whether these macroeconomic changes, the things that Teresa calls shocks. And we're looking forward to your discussion explaining kind of how these younger workers are also at significant risks, and some of the things that your program is doing to support these youth, both during COVID and plans for post-COVID. So turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. So again, my name is Kelly Pavage. I'm from the Bridges from School to Work program. I am the Managing Director of Operations. Jody, can you advance the slide, please? So our organization has been around for 30 years. We are in 12 cities across the country. As it says here, we're primarily in Title I schools. We work with people with disabilities between the ages of 17 and 24 years old, finding competitive integrated employment. It is really important to us that we have that one-on-one support for our young adults as they transition into the world of work. We do job readiness training. We assist them with job development, and then finding and securing employment. We also make sure that we assist them with keeping that job for 1 year post their hire date. As we all know, a lot happens between the time everybody finds a job to the time that they want to get that advancement. So we are working with them on a weekly basis to do that. Our program year typically goes from July 1 to June 30th every year. And in that year, we recruit approximately 1,000 young adults. 88% of them have a placement rate. So we find them an entry-level job, typically in retail or food and beverage industry, in the entertainment field, or in hospitality. And of those that find and land employment, 80% have a retention rate of staying on a job for 90 days and up to 180 days. Can you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So this has been a very challenging time for our organization, as it has been for everybody else. This year we have recruited and enrolled 742 young adults into the program here. I am very proud to say that 97% are still engaged with us, which is whether they're employed, they're looking for employment, or they're doing instruction. Of those 742, 77% are currently employed. With COVID, 34% stayed employed because several of them were temporarily furloughed or laid off. And right now, 27% are still seeking employment. And as each of our cities decides that they're reopening, we're seeing more and more engagement for them to go back to work. Several of our participants have been affected by COVID in a variety of different ways. We've had young adults who have had family members become ill. Some of them have actually passed away, which I'm very sad to say. Others have become furloughed, and still others are the only ones working in their families. So they are then providing that family income. Can you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So some of the ways that our Bridges staff has kept our 97% of our participants engaged is through truly being that bridge between the school and having them graduate. So one example is one of our staff members in Texas helped a young adult who had no connection with his school make sure that he was connected so that he could graduate on time, because he was not receiving any of the work. So now he was able to graduate and become able to, go into the world of work. And so with New York, we partner with the NYC DOE. We're doing virtual employment skills training. We had over 1,000 young adults participate in that, and it was a 10-week session. And we also partner with major organizations and companies like Accenture in many different ways, one of which is through their Skills to Succeed platform, which has 141 online career courses. In addition to, we are in the middle of doing a 6-week Bridges/Accenture bootcamp where they're learning how to do social media platforms, networking, interview prep, and how to land a job.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate that. And actually, I'm going to now open this up for Q&A. And I've got a few preset questions. And one of them that really comes to mind, I'm going to start with you, Kelly, is this 97% engagement. And I think there's a lot of probably parents on the call that are dealing with thinking about how to deal with upcoming school for the coming year. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about some of the antidotes that might be useful for other providers in engaging, particularly students and teachers based on your work, because the engagement rate, particularly during this hard period, is impressive. And if there are lessons from how Bridges has been effective for other folks, that would be helpful to hear.
Well, thank you for the question, David. I think that for us, it's really been making sure that we have those relationships and that open communication, meeting our teachers and our students where they're at. So we have learned that not everybody is comfortable with video conferencing. So we've had to train everybody on how to do that and teaching them that it's okay if they don't have their video cameras on, to then having them learn how to do that in a comfortable setting, because now what's happening is they're actually getting interviews with companies like UPS to land employment. And making sure, David, that they have technology, because not all of them have technology. So figuring out different ways to make sure that they have those additional resources.
Thank you, Kelly. And so, Teresa, I'm going to ask sort of the same variation of the question to you. For older workers, they might or might not necessarily have access to these types of programs. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about whether there are programs, other resources that can help the exact populations that you mentioned, particularly the populations that might have been most at risk for losing job and facing that difficult retirement period that you described in your presentation.
I'm going to answer the question with, again, an historical framework. It used to be with the Older Americas Act, there was a lot of money at universities with the AARP to provide very particular job training and retraining programs for older workers. Unions in the manufacturing sector, steel, auto, had their own job retraining programs. It was very much a community effort, but the money either came from collective bargaining or came from the federal government. Over time, as you've known, you probably have evaluated some of these programs, we have seen less and less attention to the older workers' reemployment as we've seen more and more older workers having to work because their pensions have not kept up with their needs. So we had this odd situation where we had more and more older workers ready to work and less and fewer programs. But to give hope to the audience, there still are job training programs that are available for everybody, but further that
It's me, girl.